There's a moment in every confrontation where you realize you've made a terrible mistake. For Officers Reeves and Matt, that moment came when they heard footsteps approaching from behind. Measured, confident footsteps. The kind that belong to someone who doesn't need to announce their authority. The man they'd just arrested remained perfectly still on the wet ground, almost as if he was waiting for something or someone. What the officers didn't know was that their entire careers were about to end. Within minutes, an unexpected authority would arrive and transform their routine arrest into a lesson about the dangerous gap between civilian law enforcement and military protocol. But to understand how it all went wrong, we need to go back to where it started. Before we dive in, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We're always amazed by how far these stories reach. Lance Sergeant Daniel Wix stepped out of the private terminal at Heathrow's Terminal 5, his civilian clothes hanging neatly on his frame, but something in his posture marked him as different from the travelers hurrying past. The navy blue garment bag slung over his shoulder bore a brass plate that read Coldstream Guards, containing his ceremonial uniform carefully pressed and ready for the evening's regimental dinner. He was waiting for transport to Wellington Barracks, having just returned from his Brussels assignment. To any casual observer, he looked like just another passenger making his way through the terminal. PC Marcus Reeves had 3 years on the force, while his partner, Sergeant Keith Matt, brought 22 years of experience to their patrol. They knew the rhythms of their territory, the faces that belonged and the ones that didn't quite fit. When they spotted Wix walking with that particular kind of measured stride, something triggered their professional instincts. Not alarm exactly, but curiosity. The way he carried himself suggested purpose, discipline. In their experience, that could mean many things. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Reeves called out as they approached. His tone was routine, professional. "Could we have a word?" Wix stopped immediately, turning to face them with the kind of attention that comes naturally to someone accustomed to authority. His response was polite but formal. "Of course, officers. How can I help you?" The politeness itself seemed somehow practiced, rehearsed. Sergeant Matt stepped closer, his experienced eyes scanning Wix from head to toe. "Just a routine check, sir." "Could we see some identification?" Without hesitation, Wix reached into his jacket pocket and produced his MOD identity card along with his Brussels assignment papers. His movements were precise, economical. He held the documents out with both hands, the way someone presents important papers to a superior officer. Reeves examined the military identification card, noting the official seals and formatting. The assignment papers showed a posting to Brussels, legitimate military paperwork with all the proper stamps and signatures. The documents were clearly authentic, complete with contact information for Wellington Barracks verification. Everything appeared to be in order, yet something about the man's bearing continued to nag at both officers. "Military, then," Matt observed, his voice carrying a slight edge of skepticism. "What brings you to this part of the terminal?" "I'm on leave, sir," Wix replied, maintaining his respectful posture, returning to barracks for a regimental function this evening. The formality of his speech, the way he stood at a modified position of attention even while in civilian clothes, created an odd tension in the busy terminal corridor. Other passengers began to slow their pace, sensing something developing. The officers exchanged glances, their suspicion growing despite the legitimate documentation in their hands. Officer Reeves leaned forward slightly, studying Wix's face for any sign of deception. "These papers show you're stationed in Brussels, long way from home for just a dinner." "Yes, sir. It's a significant regimental occasion." Wix's answer came without hesitation, but his military bearing seemed to intensify under scrutiny rather than relax. What the officers interpreted as potential evasiveness was actually 8 years of military training teaching him to maintain formal posture and refuse to fidget under pressure. To civilian eyes unfamiliar with military protocol, his composure appeared almost theatrical. "What are you really doing here?" Reeves pressed. The words hung in the air between them. Wix maintained his steady gaze, recognizing the shift in tone but responding with the same measured professionalism that had served him through 8 years of service. "Exactly what I've stated, sir." His calm response was meant as courtesy, but to Officers Reeves and Matt, it sounded like someone trying to complicate a simple situation. Their experience with difficult individuals had taught them that legitimate people rarely maintained such rigid formality during routine questioning. The crowd around them began to grow as curious onlookers sensed the tension building. Wix remained perfectly still, his ceremonial bag held securely at his side, waiting for the officers to make their next move. His patience was military patience, the kind that comes from standing guard duty in all weather, from waiting for orders that might not come for hours. But patience, when viewed through suspicious eyes, can look like stubbornness. The very qualities that made Daniel Wix an exemplary soldier were being misread as signs of deception by officers who had never encountered genuine military bearing, outside of movies and television. The first crack in the situation appeared when Sergeant Matt stepped closer, his frustration with Wix's formal responses beginning to show. "You're being awfully calm about all this." What they didn't realize was that they were looking at 8 years of ceremonial discipline, not defiance. But in that moment, as the tension thickened around them, Matt's attention began to focus on something else entirely. The navy blue garment bag with its brass plate reading Coldstream Guards became the center of Officer Matt's attention. Something about the way Wix protected it suggested importance beyond ordinary luggage. "We're going to need to see what's in that bag," Matt announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to compliance. Wix shifted slightly, his grip on the bag tightening almost imperceptibly. For the first time since the encounter began, his composure showed a crack of concern. "Sir, I would prefer to move somewhere more private if you need to inspect my personal effects." The request seemed reasonable enough, but Officer Reeves interpreted it as an attempt to control the situation. His experience told him that people with nothing to hide didn't make conditions about where and how searches were conducted. "Right here is fine," he replied firmly. "Open the bag." What the officers couldn't understand was the conflict raging in Wix's mind. Inside that bag hung his ceremonial dress uniform, complete with polished brass buttons bearing the royal cipher and regimental plates that marked him as a member of the household division. Crown regalia entrusted to servicemen are handled with ritual dignity and are not meant for public display. The garment bag contained his scarlet tunic with its distinctive blue collar and gold braiding, each thread placed according to regulations that dated back generations. The ceremonial sword belt, the white gloves that never showed a fingerprint, the bearskin cap that stood as a symbol of British military excellence around the world. Every piece was Crown property, entrusted to his care with the understanding that it would be treated with appropriate protocol. "I understand your need to verify my identity," Wix said carefully, his voice maintaining its respectful tone despite the growing tension. "But military protocol requires proper handling of these items. Perhaps we could step inside that shop entrance, away from the crowd." His suggestion was born from genuine adherence to procedure, not an attempt to hide anything illicit. Military protocol had been drilled into him from his first day of service. Crown property deserved reverence, not public display for the entertainment of curious onlookers who were now gathering in greater numbers. Officer Reeves stepped closer, his patience wearing thin. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Open the bag now, or we'll open it for you." The ultimatum hung between them like a challenge. Wix understood that his refusal to comply would escalate the situation, but his training ran deeper than his immediate comfort. The uniform inside that bag represented not just his own service, but the service of thousands of guardsmen who had worn similar regalia in defense of the realm. Matt reached toward the bag's zipper, his movement quick and decisive. Wix instinctively pulled back, protecting the contents with a motion that looked defensive to the officers, but was actually procedural. "Please, sir, let me handle it properly." The crowd around them began to murmur as the tension became obvious to everyone present. Cell phone cameras appeared, drawn by the drama unfolding between the uniformed officers and the well-dressed civilian who seemed determined to protect whatever he carried. What should have been a simple verification was becoming a public spectacle. The officers saw obstruction where military training demanded proper procedure. They witnessed defiance where centuries of tradition required dignified handling of royal regalia. The gap between civilian law enforcement and military protocol had never seemed wider. Reeves grabbed for the bag's handle, his frustration boiling over into action. "That's enough. You're being deliberately difficult." Wix maintained his grip to prevent the ceremonial uniform from being mishandled according to his training regarding crown property. His protective instinct was that of a guardian following protocol, not a criminal resisting authority, but the distinction was lost in the heat of the moment. The bag contained everything the officers needed to verify his identity and legitimate purpose. The name tape sewn inside the tunic collar, the service number embroidered on the inner lining, the Brussels posting documentation tucked into the garment bag's side pocket. Every question they had asked could have been answered by examining these items with appropriate care and respect. But respect was exactly what the situation lacked. Two different worlds had collided outside Terminal 5, each operating under rules the other didn't understand. The ceremonial regalia that could have resolved everything was becoming the focal point of a confrontation that neither side wanted, but both seemed powerless. To prevent. The very protocol that defined Daniel Wix as a soldier was about to be mistaken for the kind of arrogance that justified force. Officer Reeves had reached his breaking point with the measured responses and formal tone that seemed to mock his authority. The punch came without warning. Reeves's fist connected with Wix's jaw with the full force of 3 years of street patrol frustration behind it. The impact sent the Lance Sergeant stumbling backward, his feet slipping on the wet pavement. He went down hard, his body hitting the concrete with a sound that made several bystanders gasp. The ceremonial bag flew from his grip, skidding across the sidewalk until it came to rest against a lamppost. Wix lay motionless for several seconds, his face pressed against the cold, wet pavement. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, mixing with the rainwater that had been collecting in the street's uneven surfaces throughout the morning. What happened next would have surprised anyone who didn't understand military training. Wix didn't fight back. He remained where he had fallen, his hands visible at his sides, his breathing controlled despite the pain radiating through his skull. 8 years of service had taught him to remain composed under pressure. That escalation only made bad situations worse. Officer Matt moved quickly to join his partner, interpreting Wix's stillness as sullen defiance rather than professional discipline. The way the man lay there, not moving, not protesting, seemed almost mocking. His silence felt calculated, designed to make them look bad in front of the growing crowd. "Get up," Matt ordered, grabbing Wix by the shoulder and rolling him onto his back. Still no resistance. The Lance Sergeant's eyes were focused but calm, tracking the officer's movements without showing fear or anger. His expression remained neutral even as Matt pulled his arms behind his back with unnecessary force. The handcuffs clicked into place with metallic finality. Wix winced as the metal bit into his wrists, but maintained his military bearing even in this degrading position, face down on dirty pavement with his hands cuffed behind his back. To the officers, this composure looked like arrogance. To the gathering crowd, it looked like something else entirely. Cell phone cameras appeared from every direction, their digital clicks punctuating the tension. The modern reflex to document confrontation meant that dozens of people were now recording the scene, capturing every angle of a uniformed serviceman being restrained on a public street. The footage showed a man who had been struck without provocation, who had fallen without fighting back, who now lay cuffed and bleeding while maintaining an almost supernatural calm. "Jesus Christ," someone in the crowd muttered, the words carrying clearly over the ambient street noise. Others began to murmur among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz of disapproval that the officers couldn't ignore. The narrative was shifting in real time, transmitted through social media at the speed of modern outrage. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd spoke louder than the rest. That's assault, that is. Man wasn't doing anything but talking." Her Yorkshire accent cut through the tension with moral authority that made several other bystanders nod in agreement. The officers found themselves surrounded not just by curious onlookers, but by potential witnesses to what was increasingly looking like excessive force. Matt knelt beside Wix, checking his restraints with the kind of aggressive efficiency that suggested he was still viewing this as a legitimate arrest rather than a mistake spiraling out of control. The ceremonial bag lay forgotten several feet away, its brass plate catching the light as curious onlookers began to notice the military markings. What the officers saw as necessary force to subdue a resistant suspect, the witnesses recognized as an unprovoked attack on military discipline. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Two men trained to enforce civilian law had just assaulted someone trained to serve the crown, and the difference in their conduct under pressure was becoming obvious to everyone present except the officers themselves. Inside the nearby airport terminal, Flight Lieutenant Morrison watched the scene unfold through the large windows overlooking the street. His military eye immediately recognized what the local police had missed. The way the man maintained his bearing even while handcuffed, the protective instinct he had shown toward his garment bag, the formal responses that had so frustrated his captors. Morrison had seen that bearing before, knew what it meant. He reached for his phone and began making calls. The viral moment was being born on the wet pavement outside. But inside the terminal, someone who understood military protocol was setting in motion a response that would change everything. The measured footsteps that would soon approach from behind were already being summoned through channels the local officers didn't even know existed. Flight Lieutenant Morrison pressed his face closer to the terminal window, his military instincts sharpening as he watched the scene unfold on the street below. 22 years of Royal Air Force service had taught him to recognize his own kind, and everything about the handcuffed man's bearing screamed professional soldier. The way he maintained perfect stillness even while bleeding, the protective instinct he had shown toward his garment bag, the formal responses that had clearly frustrated his captors. Morrison had seen that exact posture 1,000 times in joint operations with the Household Division. His fingers moved across his phone screen with practiced efficiency, scrolling through contacts accumulated over 2 decades of inter-service cooperation. The first call went to Household Division headquarters at Wellington Barracks, where a duty officer answered on the second ring. Morrison's voice carried the crisp authority of someone reporting a genuine emergency rather than filing routine paperwork. Within minutes, that initial call had triggered a cascade of communications through military networks that operated on entirely different principles than civilian police channels. The duty officer at Wellington Barracks contacted Royal Security Coordination, who immediately flagged the incident as involving potential assault on Crown personnel. These weren't bureaucratic channels designed for convenience. They were emergency protocols built to protect the institution of the monarchy itself. The communications center at Household Division headquarters came alive with activity as senior non-commissioned officers began pulling personnel files and duty rosters. Lance Sergeant Daniel Wixs' service record painted a picture that made the street arrest look even worse than it already appeared. 8 years of exemplary service, including ceremonial duties at state occasions and overseas postings that required the highest security clearances. This wasn't some weekend warrior playing dress-up. This was a career soldier with access to royal facilities and classified information. Radio chatter increased across military police frequencies as units received deployment orders to respond to the incident. The measured voices of military operators contrasted sharply with the urgent civilian police communications still trying to process what appeared to be a routine arrest. 2 parallel systems of authority were now operating in the same space, each following protocols the other barely understood. Morrison's second call went directly to Colonel Alistair Henshaw's personal mobile. The colonel had been reviewing paperwork in his office when the phone rang, but Morrison's rapid briefing sent him reaching for his car keys before the conversation ended. Henshaw understood immediately that this wasn't just about one soldier's dignity. This was about the relationship between military and civilian authority, about respect for the crown servants, about protocols that existed for very good reasons. The viral footage spreading across social media platforms added another layer of urgency to the military response, increasing pressure on military leadership to respond swiftly to what appeared to be an unprovoked assault on Crown personnel. Military protocol demanded swift resolution when Crown personnel were unlawfully detained by civilian authorities. The Household Division didn't just protect royal residences and conduct ceremonial duties. They were active military units with all the legal protections and jurisdictional authorities that came with service to the sovereign. The Household Division considered this an assault on Crown personnel, and military protocols existed specifically for protecting service members and Crown property in such situations. Colonel Henshaw's staff car moved through downtown traffic with the kind of purposeful efficiency that military drivers brought to emergency responses. His aide had already contacted the local police station to announce his arrival, using language that made it clear this wasn't a courtesy call. The Armed Forces Act gave military authorities powers to assert jurisdiction when Crown personnel and property were involved, and he intended to use every bit of that authority. The communications web extended beyond immediate military channels. Royal security coordination had protocols for incidents that could affect public perception of the monarchy. Cabinet Office security briefings would need to be updated. The Ministry of Defense press office was already preparing statements that balanced support for proper law enforcement with protection of military personnel dignity. On the wet pavement outside, Officers Reeves and Matt remained unaware of the storm building around them. Their radio communications focused on routine arrest procedures and prisoner transport logistics. They saw a successful conclusion to a difficult encounter with an uncooperative suspect. They couldn't see the institutional machinery mobilizing to correct what military leadership viewed as a catastrophic mistake. The response now approaching carried the authority of centuries of military tradition. Someone who understood that respect for Crown service wasn't just about ceremony and pageantry. It was about the fundamental relationship between military and civilian power in a constitutional monarchy. The crowd began to sense a shift in the atmosphere as a figure approached with unmistakable command presence. Colonel Alistair Henshaw moved through the crowd with the kind of presence that made people step aside without thinking. His uniform bore the insignia of 3 decades of military service, but it was his bearing that commanded immediate respect. The way he walked suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives, someone who understood that authority came not from volume or aggression, but from competence and moral clarity. Conversations died as the colonel approached, replaced by the kind of respectful silence that military authority naturally commanded. His eyes swept the scene with practiced efficiency, taking in the handcuffed figure on the wet pavement, the scattered ceremonial bag, the cell phone cameras recording every moment. 28 years of service had taught him to assess situations quickly and completely. He knelt beside Wix with the kind of careful attention that marked him as someone who understood military protocol. His first words cut through the tension with absolute clarity. "Lance Sergeant Wix, sir." The formal address immediately established proper military courtesy, treating the handcuffed soldier with the respect to his rank and service record. The simple acknowledgement transformed the dynamic from criminal suspect to fellow serviceman. Henshaw helped Wix into a sitting position, his movements gentle but authoritative. The blood on the Lance Sergeant's face and the obvious pain in his jaw told part of the story, but the colonel's trained eye saw more. He recognized the controlled breathing, the maintained composure, the way Wix continued to hold himself with dignity despite his circumstances. The colonel turned his attention to the officers, his gaze steady and measuring. "What exactly did Lance Sergeant Wix do that you considered suspicious enough to warrant physical force?" The question was calm but pointed, designed to expose the weakness of their justification. His military bearing made it clear that he expected complete and honest answers. Officer Reeves stepped forward, his confidence from earlier beginning to waver. "Sir, this individual was being uncooperative during a routine stop. He refused to comply with lawful orders and was resisting our investigation." His explanation sounded rehearsed, the kind of language designed to justify force after the fact. The officers exchanged glances, suddenly aware that their version of events might not sound as reasonable under scrutiny from someone who understood military personnel and procedures. Matt attempted to explain about the formal responses and protective behavior with the garment bag, but his words seemed increasingly thin when spoken to someone who recognized these actions for what they actually were. 8 years of ceremonial duty creates a certain kind of composure, Henshaw explained to the growing crowd, his voice carrying clearly over the street noise. These men are trained to maintain dignity under pressure, to respond with courtesy even in difficult circumstances. What you interpreted as arrogance was actually excellence in military bearing. What you saw as resistance was respect for Crown property. The explanation reframed the entire incident for everyone present. The crowd began to understand that they had witnessed not defiance but discipline, not criminal behavior but military professionalism at its finest. Henshaw reached into his jacket and produced a copy of the Armed Forces Act, its pages marked with tabs and annotations from years of reference. Under the Armed Forces Act, I am asserting military jurisdiction over this incident. Lance Sergeant Wix is subject to military law and military authority. His detention by civilian police without proper cause constitutes unlawful restraint of military personnel. The legal boundary became crystal clear as Henshaw spoke. The authority that Officers Reeves and Matt had assumed they possessed evaporated in the face of someone who understood the complex relationship between military and civilian law enforcement. Wix had been carrying ceremonial regalia on official travel orders, and assault on serving Household Division personnel was a matter the military could escalate through proper channels. This soldier was traveling under official orders with Crown property in his possession, Henshaw continued, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. The ceremonial uniform in that bag represents centuries of military tradition and service to the sovereign. Your failure to recognize legitimate military bearing and your resort to violence against a serving member of the Household Division constitutes a serious breach of protocol. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear when force was applied had completely reversed. The officers who thought they were enforcing the law discovered they had violated it in ways that would end their careers and possibly result in criminal charges of their own. Military police vehicles approached with their distinctive markings and professional efficiency, their arrival signaling that the situation was about to change dramatically once again. Sergeant Major Williams knelt beside the handcuffed soldier with the kind of careful attention that marked proper military protocol. His key turned in the handcuffs with quiet precision, removing the restraints that had held a fellow serviceman in degrading circumstances for the duration of the confrontation. "Stand easy, Lance Sergeant," Williams said softly, helping Wix to his feet with a respect due to someone who had endured assault while maintaining military bearing throughout the ordeal. The crowd watched in fascination as military courtesy replaced civilian aggression, as dignity was restored through simple acts of professional recognition. What happened next would reverse every assumption the crowd had made about authority and justice. Military Police Corporal Davies approached Officers Reeves and Matt with handcuffs of his own, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone making arrests under military jurisdiction. "Officers Reeves and Matt, you are under arrest for assault on military personnel and interference with Crown property. You have the right to remain silent." The power structure that had seemed so absolute just minutes earlier collapsed with stunning speed. The officers who had felt justified in using force against an uncooperative suspect now found themselves taken into custody, facing charges that would follow them through disciplinary hearings and legal proceedings. Their protests about following proper procedure fell on deaf ears as military police processed them with the same professional efficiency they had failed to show their victim. Colonel Henshaw stepped forward as the arrests were completed, his presence commanding absolute attention from everyone gathered on the crowded street. The viral footage capturing his words would become a masterclass in leadership, authority exercised through moral clarity rather than physical force. His voice carried clearly over the ambient noise of downtown traffic and curious conversations. "Gentlemen," he began, addressing not just the arrested officers but the entire crowd, What you witnessed today was not defiance or criminal behavior. You saw 8 years of military training in action. Lance Sergeant Wix responded to aggression with restraint, to violence with dignity, to chaos with composure. These are the qualities we demand from those who serve the crown. His explanation cut to the heart of what had gone so terribly wrong during the initial encounter. The formal responses that had frustrated the officers represented excellence in military bearing, not arrogance or mockery. The protective instinct Wix had shown toward his ceremonial bag reflected proper respect for crown property, not suspicious behavior requiring forceful investigation. Excellence should inspire curiosity, not fear, Henshaw continued, his words measured and deliberate. When you encounter someone who maintains dignity under pressure, discipline is often mistaken for defiance. Respect is earned by actions, not demanded through force. The crowd began to understand they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple police encounter gone wrong. They had seen the difference between authority based on power and authority based on respect, between enforcement through fear and leadership through example. The cell phone footage spreading across social media now told a completely different story than it had 30 minutes earlier. An elderly man near the front of the crowd, his Yorkshire accent thick with emotion, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That's what a real soldier looks like. Takes a beating and never loses his bearing. That's discipline, that is." His words captured what many others were beginning to recognize. Daniel Wix had demonstrated genuine strength through restraint, real courage through controlled response to violence. The qualities that made him an exemplary soldier had been invisible to officers trained to see resistance where they should have seen respect, defiance where they should have recognized duty. Military police vehicles departed with their new prisoners while Colonel Henshaw personally escorted Wix toward a staff car waiting at the curb. The ceremonial bag that had caused so much conflict was retrieved and handled with appropriate care, its contents still protected from the public display that had seemed so threatening to civilian law enforcement. The crowd dispersed slowly, many still recording and commenting on what they had witnessed. True authority revealed itself through restraint rather than aggression, through understanding rather than assumption. Lance Sergeant Daniel Wix would return to Wellington Barracks in fresh uniform, his honor not only intact but enhanced by his conduct under impossible circumstances. Military justice had been swift, complete, and precisely calibrated to the offense. The cameras kept rolling as the story began to spread beyond the street where it happened. Have you ever witnessed discipline being mistaken for arrogance, or seen someone maintain their composure when others would have lost control? What do you think about the clash between military and civilian authority in situations like this? The footage went viral within hours and sparked national discussion about police training and military respect. News channels picked up the story, using it to examine broader questions about authority, jurisdiction, and the delicate balance between civilian law enforcement and military tradition. Training academies began reviewing their protocols for encounters with military personnel, while legal experts debated the boundaries of different jurisdictional authorities. This incident exposed critical training and communication gaps between civilian police and military units, sparking reviews at multiple levels of law enforcement and military coordination. What do you think should change in training or protocols to prevent similar confrontations? Subscribe for more investigative stories exploring the intersection of tradition and authority. Sometimes the most powerful response comes through perfect stillness under pressure.